So, into the milieu of this American civil religion, there's a few other forces that are going to be happening that are important to the founding of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. One is happening down in Virginia, North Carolina, centered around a man by the name of James O'Kelly. O'Kelly was born sometime between 1735 and 1755. We're not exactly sure when. Um, and was born in Ireland, but emigrated to the United States, and settled in Surrey County, Virginia, and then Chatham, North Carolina. Uh, O'Kelly was, well, he was 5'10" and 120 pounds, so he was a twig of a man. And he was, it's said that he whined the gospel. He had a high voice. His education is uncertain. Um, but he met with and associated with folks like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. He married Elizabeth Meeks, and the Meeks family came from money. So Elizabeth was active in the Methodist Society, and their son eventually converted their father, James, to Methodism. Uh, James began preaching in late 1777. Um, And in 1784, he attended the Conference of Methodist Preachers um, around Christmas in Baltimore. He eventually had trouble with the Methodist hierarchy. He didn't like the fact that a bishop can appoint you to serve in a certain location and there's no recourse. He reacted against the Methodist hierarchy and wanted to do away with the fact that bishops could appoint you to a certain location without any recourse. Um, so, and he uh, fought against that and eventually lost that fight. And eventually broke away from Methodism and founded what he called the Republican Methodists, which did not have the hierarchy that the Methodist Church has. Um, and this was around Surrey County in Western Virginia. Um, Eventually, they had 30 preachers and 1,000 members who followed in uh, the Republican Methodists. One of his colleagues was Rice Haggard, who rejected the Republican Methodist name and suggested that it just be called Christian. And it was Rice Haggard who eventually recommended to Barton Stone the name Christian for the church. Um, After O'Kelly's death, and his family unfortunately burned all his papers and his autobiography upon his death. We don't know why. Um, but after his death, his followers, some of them migrated west and eventually became part of the Stone movement that we'll talk about next week. Uh, Meanwhile, up in New England, there are two preachers who have joined together by the name of Elias Smith and Abner Jones. Yes, Smith and Jones. It sounds like an alias, but it's actually their names, Elias Smith and Abner Jones. They were both Baptists in New England, but reacted against the Calvinism of the Baptists at the time, and broke away from them to form what was called the Christian Convention. They the Christians in New England um, proclaimed that there was no creed but Christ, no book but the Bible. They had a goal of restoring primitive Christianity to the church. Um, and some of their other, the elements of their worship were that they disapproved of music. They didn't like the term reverent. They didn't, that was not part of their usage. They insisted on preaching without notes, so that a preacher had to preach extemporaneously without any sort of notes or outline. And when preaching, you couldn't wear eyeglasses. So, for those who needed eyeglasses anyways, notes would have been lost because you couldn't wear eyeglasses. Uh, and in an odd little thing, they rejected colored undergarments. I'm not sure what that's about or where it came from or what happened to it, um, but there you have it. Smith and Jones movement uh, took hold in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and eventually it spread. And they, at one point, did meet with O'Kelly and worked to, to establish to talk about establishing one church, though that never happened. Uh, but in the westward movement of this country, um, some of their people moved westward and eventually joined up with the Campbellites, again, whom we'll discuss next week. But the Campbells, Alexander Campbell and Thomas Campbell, uh, both early founders with Barton Stone of our denomination. So this is the milieu in which we find um, our beginnings. On the one hand, American civil religion is burgeoning, and there's a looking back to the past of the early founding of the United States as its own religious uh, elements. Well, where in established religion, there's a breaking away from European and specifically English ways of doing things, and a populism growing within the religious hierarchies uh, that give more, that spread out the power, that take away from the Methodist hierarchy or the Calvinist hierarchy, uh, and spread that among the people. Um, Smith and Jones in New England, O'Kelly in the South, both were forming a new way of doing things that was not European. And it's into this mix, then, that the Campbells and Stone start to do their work in the early 1800s. And next week we'll talk about them specifically and how they uh, created a new religious movement in the new country that was formed, the United States. Thanks.